I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, welcoming you to the Mosaic of Wine Series 1. Giving my audience of wine lovers, students and professionals from across the world access to some of the most interesting, successful and influential people working in and around the world of wine. Series episodes explore the guest's backstory, covering their foundations, growth and legacy, using Interpreting Wine's Mosaic storytelling model. I would love this episode and this series to be the start of a conversation, so please make sure you're subscribed to Interpreting Wine podcast to be alerted when each series episode goes live. We continue the Mosaic of Wine series today in the company of Richard Hemming MW, Head of Wine Asia for 67 Pall Mall Singapore. We hear Richard's origin story, covering UK and Australia wine retail and writing for Jancis Robinson. We discuss the MW community in Singapore, as well as multilingual communication there, before getting into Richard's self-described restrained communication style and its integration with 67 Pall Mall's business development. We talk wine industry communication styles, discuss whether the wine industry has a right to exist, before getting into the 67 Pall Mall Global Wine Communicator Awards, which Richard organised, and the book project which Richard led, Wine and the Food of Asia, a 67 Pall Mall book. Enjoy.
I start introducing myself these days by saying how long I've been in the industry, which is one of those worrying traits that means you've been around a while. And for me, it's 23 years. And when I first started, it was at Majestic Wine in Harrogate, because I'd studied in Leeds and applied in a kind of classic aimless fashion to a job in the back of the Leeds student newspaper, which was for Majestic Wine. And that's where my wine career started. Previously, I had had no interest particularly in wine, certainly no knowledge. But I did think that I quite fancied the idea of working in a shop. And I remember actually going into one of the branches and seeing on the door that they had the working hours printed as from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. And this was before I was employed. And I went in and I said, so that must be like, shifts or something, right? You do like a half day. And they said, oh no, we do 10 till 8 every single day. And that was my introduction to wine retail. But Majestic was great. I learned a lot. I did my WSET up to diploma level. I stuck around with Majestic for 6 years. I ended up doing a bit of teaching internally. And obviously by that stage was heavily invested in the wine world. I'd managed to do a bit of traveling with various producers and organizations. So I'd been to Margaret River, for example, and I definitely got the bug. But I didn't want to stay in retail. I was 29 when I left Majestic, and I had the opportunity to travel. I was single at the time, didn't have a mortgage or kids or anything. So I went to Australia to, funnily enough, work in a wine shop. So that was like moving from one side of the world to the other to do exactly the same thing. But that then led me to a job doing harvest. And actually, this was a real pivotal moment for me, because not only did I learn so much during that 3 months of doing harvest in McLaren Vale, it was exactly what prompted me to start writing. I had been writing for my own amusement. I never started a blog or anything. This was pre-social media. I was just writing Word documents and saving them on my computer. And I entered a few competitions, one of which was called the Young Wine Writer of the Year competition. And I came runner-up in 2 consecutive years. And the second year was when I was doing harvest. I found out that I just missed out again. And I was so frustrated with that I decided I was going to send my losing article to some other people for a second opinion. And one of those people that I contacted completely out of the blue was Jancis Robinson, who messaged back, as she does, within a few hours saying, well, why don't you write a little bit about what you're doing in McLaren Vale? And that's how my writing career started. I was then writing a regular column about my doing vintage, and then I came back to the UK, carried on working for Jancis. And then fast forward 7 years, 2015, I was still working for Jancis, kind of now full-time employed with her, and as well doing some jobs on the side. And 2015 was the year that I passed my MW. So that was obviously a pretty big deal. I joined the program because some of my wine writer colleagues and friends in the industry were studying, and I felt like I needed to take myself seriously and attempt this thing that, again, I'd never harbored a particular obsession with it. But I'm so glad I went for it. So became an MW in 2015, and then 4 years later relocated to Singapore. And at that point, I then ended up working with 67 Pall Mall, which is my current employer. So I'm head of wine Asia for 67 Pall Mall, based in Singapore, and have been for the last 5 years.
Yeah, amazing. And I'm guessing you don't often get to tell that whole story. I mean, it's quite an incredible collection, I would say, of experiences. As you say, from majestic to harvest, and I'm sure we're probably skipping over lots of challenges and other sort of hurdles that you had to overcome along the way. But it's interesting, though, isn't it, how these conversations go? I mean, I was chatting this morning with Malu Lambert over in South Africa. And interestingly, she also kind of has a Jancis story to tell, and just that idea of kind of, reaching out to your heroes, really. And, I think it would be, really, I think almost take us back in a way, an insight really into, who was Jancis when you were first contacting her during that harvest experience? I mean, was she was already presumably somebody who was at a high level in the wine industry, and did she kind of at that point sort of did it feel like a big step to reach out and to send her that article?
It did, completely. I sent my article to two other people, by the way, who since have become friends and colleagues. One was Jamie Good, and the other was Tom Canavan. Okay. And I really did it out of the blue and just sent a cover email saying, we don't know each other, but I've just come second in this thing. What do you think? Like, any advice? And for me, it felt like a big reach, because it was totally unsolicited. But what I've since realized is that very, very few people actually do it. And actually, Lawrence, I remember a conversation that you and I had quite a few years ago in which you said you miss 100% of the chances you don't take.
That's quite Gary Vaynerchuk-esque. It might have been where it came from.
Well, wherever it came from. I mean, it's so true. Yeah. I mean, I think we all realize that. And yet people still don't take those chances. Whenever I get an email from somebody that says, hey, you don't know me, but I am usually instantly intrigued, because it's going to be from somebody who is taking a chance, I think. I actually had an example this week where somebody messaged me via LinkedIn and said, you don't know me, but I've just joined the MW program. I'm putting together a database of people that I want to ask questions to over the next few years. Can I have your email address? And I was like, wow, that is some initiative. Like, for sure. Like, I'd be very happy to help. And not least because it demonstrates that person is really committed to it and is thinking about it proactively. And, that's very promising. And whether that's in studying wine or any other kind of aspect, career aspect, I think that's a really valuable trait. But to answer your question, sorry, who was Jancis? She was the author of the books that I had read for my WSET. I'd never seen her. I'd never met her. I wasn't a subscriber to her website. But I clearly knew, as everybody does, of her reputation as one of the most important wine critics through her FT column, but also through her academic work. Her textbooks are the standard references. And I just thought, well, here's somebody's opinion that I would really like to hear.
Yeah, I love it. And as I preempted before we started recording, I think you, for me, you've taken us down a very interesting route there, about that, because it's tapping in, I think, to elements of just demonstrating initiative, reaching out, people, that we maybe see on the screen actually being real people, and actually, responding. That's really what my question is around. Is presumably though that and you're a busy person, as I'm sure we'll really dig into. You can't get back to every request or every outreach that kind of comes out there. And I'm just curious, what other sort of things, looking back on when you've prioritized getting back to people, maybe using that example there, what are the things that kind of resonate with you when people do take that chance?
Well, actually, the first thing I'm going to say, not to try and make myself sound the best guy in the world, although if that's a side effect, then there's nothing I can do about it. But I honestly do reply to everything. And by the way, so does Jancis. I feel like one of the many things I've learned from her is just reply. Even if you're just replying quickly to say, sorry, that's not something I'm interested in.
Yeah.
It matters a lot. And if somebody is genuinely proposing something, even if I don't think I can help, then I'll often say, well, I can't help, but actually I can probably connect you to somebody, or why don't you check out this? Because that's how I got started, I guess. Plus, the wine industry is very collegiate. We're very fond of using that word, collegiate, but I think it's true. I don't feel like I'm in competition with fellow communicators or anyone. However, I will give you an example of something that I think doesn't work, and it comes from my job at 67 Pall Mall. One of the problems, I don't know whether it's a problem, one of the facts of the job is that many, many wine producers would like to get listed there, far more than we have room for, even though we have 6,500 wines on the list and growing. And often the approach I will get is, hey, you've really got to list my wine because, and then the sort of trite, I'm afraid to say, cliched justifications like we've got unique terroir. I mean, there's very little I can do with that kind of comment because it just doesn't differentiate, sadly. I mean, this is one of the challenges of the wine world, is that there's so much out there and so much of it seems so similar. So I struggle then to, justify taking the time to say to somebody, well, can you tell me how you're different to my 100 other Chilean Cabernets that I currently have on the list? And clearly, that's not going to be a constructive conversation. And then every now and then you get somebody that comes along with something that does really grab your attention, or at least they make a sort of roundabout approach and they say, could I come and see the club? I'm such a fan. And, at least not of me, by the way, of 67 Pall Mall. And then at least, it's a bit more effort rather than just a sales pitch.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that you're not alone. I think there's endless emails that go around and try to position. And I think, it's maybe we're getting already into communication. I think it's that initial outreach. I think you said the student or somebody asking you for your time and your insight. I think that's really getting into an emotional side of things, isn't it? That's stirring emotions within you. Whereas I'm guessing, as you say, a cold email sales pitch isn't really doing the job or stirring any kind of emotion within you.
No, exactly. And we sell wine on feeling. Most people that drink wine want to have an emotional association with it, even though perhaps what we talk about more often is alcohol levels and residual sugar and months in oak. So if somebody comes with some kind of hook, it's not easy because, wine sounds so similar, even though it can be very different. And a lot of small producers simply don't have the communication skills in their team, and that's where good PR agencies and good marketing agencies can really help. Because if it is just a small family operation, it's highly unlikely you're going to have all of the skills in one place. And when you do get those people, that's a great story in itself. You've got the husband and wife team who do everything single-handed, as well as labeling the bottles, emailing all of their subscribers and customers and so on, But yes, I mean, my career, I think more or less has been about communication about wine. Even when I was retailing, you were communicating with the customer. Majestic's strength was that we were good at talking to the customers. At 67, a lot of what I do is writing and podcasts and video interviews and media stuff. And that's all about getting the message out there, whether that's a specifically promotional thing or whether it's just spreading the gospel about wine.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I think really, where I'd encourage you to kind of take the conversation, Richard, is you have mentioned already, and offline as well, really the MW community, and I think that more collegiate element of the wine industry in general, being one of your very favorite parts of being in the industry. And really, I think something that we didn't really delve into too much on your last appearance is that move from the UK to Singapore, which may not even have fully kind of taken place the last time we've spoken. And I'm just curious, with it, some years now in the rearview mirror, it would be great to, just get your reflections and maybe, one or two examples of, how, I guess, did the wine industry and potentially the MW community kind of, help you and, kind of support you and not exactly in your hour of need, but, when obviously it's a new experience for you as well.
Well, there were 2 MWs already in Singapore when I arrived, and there are now 4, and hopefully more coming, because we've got a couple of students who are in quite advanced stages. I'd met both of them before. I knew them fairly well. So Tan Yingxian and Annette Scarf, both of whom had lived in Singapore for 20 plus years, both of whom, invited me to meet them. We had dinner at their houses. We drank great wine, of course. They introduced me to people. And that is a classic MW characteristic. Wherever you go, if you contact an MW, even if you don't really know them, perhaps if you've never even met them, I think there's a pretty good chance that they'll offer to meet and introduce you to people and ask you what you need to know and point you in the right direction. Because everybody remembers, as an MW, being in that situation themselves.
Yeah, I guess you had lots to do in the day job already, and I guess the 67 Pall Mall hadn't opened when you moved there, right? Because we're going back a few years now, aren't we?
Yes, yeah. So the club actually opened its doors in 2022, in March 2022, and was partly a victim of COVID. So the original projected opening date had been earlier than that. Anyway, when I moved here in July 2019, I didn't even know that the club was opening. As soon as I found out, I went to see the site and the guys. Well, it was the former GM who since moved on, but he helped me. He asked me to be involved, and Grant Ashton as well, who's the founder, was there and was happy for me to be on hand. I had been a member in the London Club, so I knew them already, and I used to use it a lot. So I knew the story, and again, I was able to communicate to anyone that we met about what the club is going to be in Singapore. So yes, it hadn't opened in 2019. I knew the story already, started working with them, and all throughout the COVID years of doing webinars, and then when the club opened, doing events, which I still love doing. Everything I'm involved with at 67 is sort of draws on the experience I've had from retail communication, viticulture, vinification, and the MW community. So it feels like it's brought everything together, which is a good feeling.
Yeah, and I think, again, it feels like we're very much getting into tune, because I think as we really spoke about on our previous interview, I think, communication is very much where, I'd like to sort of riff, if you like. And I think it's, again, your particular place there, I think you're going to have some really interesting, reflections and kind of insights to share. And I think one of the things that you mentioned kind of recording was around navigating kind of cross-language communication. I'm just curious if, during your time there, and maybe it would help to just kind of paint the picture of the day to day and also, I guess, the local culture. But, have there been, valuable lessons that you've learned from, I guess, being exposed to a sort of certainly a much more multilingual arena and society than here in the UK?
Well, firstly, it's important to say that English is one of the official languages of Singapore. So everybody can speak English. Very often people will speak Malay or Tamil or one of the Chinese dialects, none of which I can speak. So I'm relying on English. Yes, I'd have to, it would be a long journey, I think, for me to get there, but you never know. And the language of wine is English. I think wherever you go, even though a lot of the terminology might be French, the language of describing wine, the WSET, again, even though it's available in different languages, is primarily English. And most of the people in Singapore would assume immediately that any kind of wine communication would be in English. However, what I'm finding interesting at the moment is that we are just about to start our first event in Shanghai, and that is obviously very different. We need to have all of our written material available in Chinese. We need to make sure that we've got Chinese language sommeliers and staff available, because the assumption there is that you will speak in Chinese. You must, even if some of the discussion goes into English while it's concerning wine. And I will be, cut out of many of those conversations, which will be a new thing for me. It's also the first time that I've used WeChat, which is a fascinating environment to be in because it's 99% of it is in Chinese, and trying to navigate that. I mean, thank goodness these days we have kind of translation apps that can do most of it for you. But it's a fun experience, albeit a slow one, because you're having to translate as you go.
Yeah, I think it's, again, I speak from the experience of learning Spanish as an adult. Still one of the most difficult things I've ever done, but on the other side, certainly, again, one of the most rewarding things ever. And being in Spain and being able to understand those conversations when groups of Spaniards are together and they want to speak Spanish. That's normal, isn't it? Wanting to kind of speak our mother tongue. It's interesting, though, I think, as well, that presumably there is a lot of conversation that takes place among local Singaporeans that's not in English, about wine. And it's, maybe a niche question, but I'm curious, has it ever come up that maybe, there is maybe something that doesn't get translated across, perhaps necessarily, across that language barrier, or, ideas that maybe, again, are expressed outside of English that maybe, can come back and kind of influence English in a way?
Well, I think you have to think about who the audience is that you're talking to. Now, in my work, most of the people I'm talking to, members of 67 Pall Mall, they're going to know enough about wine already that the chance of any confusion is therefore diminished. If you're talking about the population as a whole, now it's only 6 million, and many of them don't drink. So you're still not talking about large numbers of people. But I mean, there's definite potential for confusion. But actually, it's just as often likely that it'll come the other way, that I will learn something that is actually a really useful way of describing things. I've become much more aware of umami type flavors since living out here. Not flavors you wouldn't have come across, soy, mushroom, even garlic to a certain extent, fish sauce, the kind of ingredients that are reasonably familiar, I think, to most people these days. But the prevalence of them, not just in the cuisine out here, but in the kind of familiarity that people have with them, means that those kinds of descriptors might come up more often when talking about certain wines. And I've learned a fantastic word that's there's this local dialect called Singlish, which is English peppered with Chinese and Malay terms, and usually delivered in a kind of particular lingo. And anyway, there's a word that when I was teaching a WSET class, I think somebody said, kind of exclaimed at the top of their voice when I'd given them a very tannic red wine.
Yeah.
And the word is siap. Oh. And that word basically means astringent, I think, but it seems to have much more resonance than saying, oh, this is an astringent wine. It has furry texture. The word siap instantly resonates with most Singaporeans that I've used it with. Now, that's just one word. I'm sure there are others that I will discover. But it's actually a really good example of it working the other way, where I'm learning terms from the wine lovers here.
Yeah, no, and again, I think it's just always again, it was something that's come up whenever I've interviewed people from South Africa, for example, and fruit descriptors, which again, I believe they're about communication, right? They're about, you're having that experience over there. You want me to be able to relate to that experience and to, I guess, empathize and see, okay, a wine that gives me that experience, would I find that pleasurable? Is that something that sounds good to me? But if I've never, had, I think the example was gooseberry, it was that, our gooseberry is not the same as a South African gooseberry. It's completely different. So, obviously then among one themselves, South Africans are not going to be using those terms. And I guess it's potentially a slightly broader point around, maybe not people who are in the club and, have sort of, tasted all of those different, and maybe have, flip the mental switch to understanding those. But I think, language is, very much it carries a lot of those, I guess, cultural identities and potentially cultural biases as well, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's been interesting arguments written about whether things like the WSET, perhaps unintentionally, are imperialist because they're imposing a very British understanding of flavor on the rest of the world. And gooseberry is the best example to use because, most people haven't come across it. You certainly never see it out here. When I say gooseberry to people here, they may know what it is, but it's highly unlikely that they've ever tasted it. I mean, I can't even remember the last time I've tasted it. Decades ago. And of course, the easiest way to teach them now is actually to give them a classic New World Sauvignon, usually a Marlborough Sauvignon, and say, like, reverse engineer the flavor out of this. Like, basically, this is gooseberry. Now, next time you taste a gooseberry, you're going to think it tastes like Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. And actually, that's just as useful because ultimately what you're trying to do is give them a framework for talking that other people understand all around the world. The problematic part of it is potentially, is that really representative of the majority experience, or are we all just learning some kind of lexicon that actually isn't particularly useful? And this is the problem with communicating about wine, is that you're trying to give language to something that's very abstract, and some kind of common language is necessary. Any kind of system is going to be hugely imperfect, and it's got to be small enough to be practical. And it's got to be in a language that the majority can understand. I mean, it's such a troublesome thing to puzzle out. Yeah,
I'm almost my head is spinning there when you mentioned, actually, if you want to know what gooseberry tastes like, have this New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, and almost potentially becomes self-referential, and actually the descriptor for gooseberry should change into New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc.
Yeah, exactly.
Looking here again and, talking about and thinking about your own style, I think this is, where, let's get a little bit more into, I guess, your day to day. You already mentioned about some of the communications that you do on behalf of the club. And I think that would be interesting, again, just to give us an insight into what your role actually is. But then I think something that came out from the pre-questionnaire, which was you talking about that restrained style. And I think that potentially gives us an interesting way to build on what we've just spoken about there in terms of cross-cultural and cross-linguistic communication.
Yeah, restrained. It's how European wines are often described in fruit character. And I've always found it a really useful word. As opposed to maybe the opulence of some other descriptions, ones that are extremely poetic and that employ kind of crazy metaphors and conjure up all sorts of exotic imagery. That's never been my style. And I think being able to prove a point without hyperbole and, with control is more satisfying in a way. I wrote a blog post that would have been 6 or 7 years ago, sort of giving my golden rules of wine writing, which was really just for my own reference. It wasn't telling everybody else how to do it. But one of them was never swear. Not because it is crude, but because it's usually ineffective. And there's almost certainly a better, more effective, more eye-catching way of trying to emphasize something than using the F word, for example. And I'm really not trying to be prudish at all. But in the written word, I just think employing some creativity, even though it may be ultimately a more restrained mode of language, is probably going to be more effective, in my view, anyway.
Interesting. And again, for context, then could you say something about how that then expresses itself in your day to day?
Well, I mean, in my day to day at the moment, I'm writing emails and newsletters, and I'm certainly not going to be swearing in any of those. That would definitely be a mistake. And very often you're trying to say the same thing. It's like I said earlier, when producers are trying to get their wines listed somewhere and they're trying to come up with something original, and very often they don't do a very good job. And I'm often trying to promote something which might seem superficially the same kind of thing. Like, here's a masterclass about Bordeaux or Burgundy, and here's a producer from Tuscany coming. And, it can very often fall into a kind of repetitive formula. But, this is something that makes it interesting for me, is how you can employ language that doesn't get outlandish and still is effective in a concise way. It's actually very closely related to how the MW exams are written, albeit in a very, very different kind of objective. But yeah, that kind of effectiveness of communication, it's not easy necessarily, but it's something that I find very satisfying.
Yeah. Okay. And presumably, the member base is responding as well. Because again, I guess I think you're in an interesting position because you're selling a product, aren't you? You're selling an experience. You're selling tastings. You're selling the memberships. There's a lot that you're, I guess, needing to. In a sense that I've always found it helpful when talking about business. There's really two sides to talk about. I think there's the supply side. There's everything that happens back of house, and for wine, of course, this is all of I think this is maybe for me where the wine industry leans too heavily. Because if you're talking about the residual sugar, the acid, the months in oak, et cetera, I believe this is much more this is kind of saying and reinforcing the quality, really, that and if you like, showing what's happened in the kitchen, what's actually happened as they've been preparing the wine, versus the driving demand, actually making, developing brand, telling stories, talking about something that maybe for me, it does actually translate better through podcasts, through the written word, through abstract communication, than talking, for me, too much about just the sensorial experience just by itself.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think one of the great benefits of having been communicating in the period that we both have been is that the options open to us, the channels, whether it's podcast, video, blogs, self-published books, have allowed everybody to communicate. The barrier to entry now is effectively zero. And that means you get such a huge array of different communication styles that you can choose the one that you like. Of course, the challenge is sometimes finding the one that you like in the first place, because there's so much other stuff out there. I mean, this is now the problem with everything. Trying to just find something to watch on a streaming service can be hard enough, because you feel like you're just churning through pages and pages of stuff you don't want, looking for something that's really going to hit the spot. I mean, podcasts is the same. Even if you just look at wine podcasts, there are so many now. And ultimately, I would much rather it was that way around. I embrace the range and a diversity of it all.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think as well. We certainly in the UK. And when I was growing up, there were only 3 channels available, and it's very much that was what you had. Even before you had a video player, a VCR. And no internet, and I'm making myself sound really old here, but there's maybe something a little bit nostalgic about remembering going to school. And I know this is something you and I spoke about before, but I don't think anyone can really understand how much of a cultural phenomenon a show like Neighbours was. It was literally kind of just took over our lives for a good sort of 2-3 years, I think. We're not going back. Let's just say that. Certainly.
No, definitely not. I mean, I find it interesting when you do get those cultural objects, TV shows, items, phenomena that still do unite people. So I've been out here, as I said, for the last 5 years, and I've rarely felt that I was missing out more than when I've seen these conversations about this show, The Traitors, about which I know absolutely nothing. But what I do know is that it's been a huge talking point in the UK. And that's something that, yes, things like Neighbours provided when there was basically no alternative, and probably came along at the right time, for me anyway, my formative years, teenage years. What's interesting about that show, and then similar shows at the same kind of time, basically Australian television, is that it introduced Australian culture to us, which directly led into wine culture when I was starting at Majestic, because that was the era when Australian branded Chardonnay and Shiraz was at the top of his game. And I still have an extremely high affection for, because I learned so much off those wines, and I still think that they're so accessible and easy to enjoy. And it's an intriguing thought. How much did Australian television have to do with that? Probably quite a lot, I think, because it made people familiar with that outdoor lifestyle, with sandy beaches and the kind of easygoing lifestyle that was portrayed.
Yeah, I wonder if California Wines had a Baywatch moment as well in the in the 90s. But you do actually again bring up a point that I'd love to just air and get your view on. Really, is that I absolutely I love wine. I love the people who make wine. I love traveling to wine regions. But I think, something that we maybe miss out on in the wine industry is we maybe again on that, looking just at that supply side. I think when you think about the demand side of things and you think about what people want and how long they have to consume a bottle of wine, in the course of a normal day, it's such a small window. Normal people are not like you and I, going to tastings at 10:30 in the morning. The window is probably for most people, what is it? 3-4 hours a day, more or less, and that is the only kind of chance, really. I think a lot of, again, supply side driven wine communication has to actually really hit home and kind of influence people. Whereas I think, if we think about other trends, wine travel, just travel in general, the other activities that can take place in wine regions, thinking about those mountains, those sports, etc. It just feels to me as though there's a big opportunity being missed to actually attract mind share by tying wine into all these other things: the travel, the food, the location itself, not just through terroir, but just through other activities that can take place in that region.
Yeah, I mean, there are famous regions that do the hospitality thing extremely well. South Africa, around the Western Cape, Margaret River, which I mentioned earlier, I think. Even Bordeaux has got a pretty good tourism scene. Not that I've been for years, but from what I've heard. But I think you've also got to remember, on a broader scale, how many people around the world will remain unmoved by what wine has to offer. And there's nothing wrong with that, I think sometimes the wine industry can be guilty of assuming that there's going to be a natural interest in wine at all. I mean, one of the things that we're faced with right now is this apparent massive decline in consumption through basic ambivalence from a younger group of drinkers. And some of the data really seems to support that. I don't know whether this is just a cycle that we'll come out of. Nobody knows. But what I do think is true is wine industry needs to remain humble and kind of sometimes take stock of the fact that there's no natural right that it has to continue existing. I mean, there's massive overproduction. Sorry to suddenly go into a bit of a negative downward spiral, but
no, it's
these are the truths that often get just sort of avoided. I've heard rumors about Bordeaux negociants that have warehouses full of stock that they can't sell. Their finances are absolutely teetering on the brink. There are producers whose livelihoods are basically propped up by bank loans. I mean, this is the sad end of the industry, of course, but you have to remind yourself, like, what right do any of them necessarily have? What are the answers? I'm not just being incredibly pessimistic here and saying, well, forget it, that, survival of the fittest and those guys will just have to crash and burn. I don't mean it like that. But I do mean that a broader picture of where wine sits in not just the world of drinks, but in the world in general, is something that's very hard to take sometimes. That perspective is hard to take. And by that, I mean, it's hard to hear it, but it's also hard to have it, to get zoomed out far enough to be able to have that perspective.
Again, I agree. I think, to an extent, if we're only looking at the supply side, then I think there's a limited amount of demand that's ever going to be built up. But again, for example, last week I was at an event from Trentino in the north of Italy, and again, I'm sure like any region, they're wanting to stimulate demand, and I thought it was very interesting that the travel and the wine, I guess, bodies are working very closely together. So they're actually, putting up a joint front. So we had a wine tasting, but then we also had a presentation about about cheese and chestnuts and hiking and skiing and, all of these other things. And it just feels as though wine is so adjacent to so many other things that are natural hooks. And for me, if those industries are booming, then we have to, I believe, think a little bit more creatively and communicate a little bit more creatively. And, why couldn't, I'll pick on Trentino again, but, why couldn't Trentino, even the wine board, they could have a podcast or a YouTube or a social media, that focuses on stuff to do, the cool stuff to do in Trentino and draw more people, cast the net wider. And as a result, get more eyes on the region and therefore on the wines.
Well, actually, I have seen some good examples of this kind of thing through influencers, for want of a better word, that collaborate with, especially with generic bodies, and they have a ready-made audience. It's not necessarily a wine audience. And they know that what plays well is exactly that kind of cross-cultural aspect. So they will do a lot of stuff with food, usually. There'll be a live music element, or there'll be a sort of tourist, beautiful hotspot, kind of sunset scene, that kind of thing, rather than just walking through vineyards and talking to winemakers. I think there's a place for both. You've always got this problem with wine in general that is about segmenting the audience. I kind of referenced it earlier. And I think there's a pretty low bar of tolerance for most people who are potentially open to some of that crossover interest into wine. But then as soon as you start going into the technical details, they're going to lose interest. Whereas, for a lot of wine businesses, the sustainability, the financial sustainability is predicated on people who are prepared to pay a lot of their disposable income on wine. And they're the ones that want to know all of the fine details about things. They're the ones who are likely to buy on Primeur or attend auctions or specifically go to wine regions to visit 3 or 4 producers every day. And keeping those two audiences separate is essential, because the crossover is so minute that you're not going to it's not going to be beneficial to try and target both at the same time.
Yeah, no, I think it's a point well made, and I just again, my mind goes to again just the fact of, okay, you have segmented, but that other audience that you're talking about, the ones who are maybe they're gonna be drawn in through the food or the travel or just nice photography and nice videography or nice sounding podcasts. That market is surely it's A, potentially massive, and B, the numbers, if we're to believe them, it would seem as though wine is not actually reaching that audience.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could take China as an example. This massive country with 1.3 billion people or whatever it is, you'd only need to capture a tiny percentage of that country, that population, and get them interested in drinking wine for it to make a really positive impact on the wine industry in general. And all of those things have been tried. All of those kind of marketing ideas and not just international companies coming in, but domestic Chinese wineries producing amazing wines and so on. And yet it hasn't really taken off in the way that you might think from the way you were just describing it. Like actually just in this last week or two, you may have seen that story about Lady Penguin, one of the top influencers on the Chinese version of TikTok, who's announced her retirement, not perhaps her retirement, but that she's stepping back from wine. And this is somebody that was selling hundreds of thousands of cases of Chilean wine under her own brand, and had built up a colossal audience from doing exactly what we were just talking about, basically making wine accessible. Overall, if you look at Chinese consumption, it's down. I mean, part of that is maybe to do with tariffs, but I think a lot of it is just that there was an overambitious expansion, which was never really supported. And again, trying not to be unduly pessimistic, just trying to be realistic. This is a well-connected country with well-traveled people with disposable income that have been shown the kind of cultural interest that wine can bring. And I think for the most part, people are somewhat interested, in the same way that a European consumer might, spend a few extra pounds a bottle at the weekend to kind of get a nice bottle to enjoy. But that's really as far as it goes.
Again, I think I appreciate your honesty, because it's really making me think as well. I think that that idea of, okay, are these cycles? But probably the phrase that will really stay with me after today is that do we have the right to all exist, and do we have the right to what I think is the most valuable commodity on the planet, almost, which is people's attention. Arguably the internet is just continuing to disrupt. We've got the internet, we've got it on our phones, but I just think that the way that it's just literally everywhere, as we would expect. But what it's actually doing is taking time. We can even go granular. Every swipe, every click, every tweet or anything at all like that. It didn't exist. When I was a lad. So it's all just taking time, and incrementally add up all of that time, and there are going to be winners and losers, and I think that the winners or the ones that reduce the least, that they're going to have have adapted to that kind of new reality, with the internet.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I was doing some research on a producer today. I'll give them a shout out. It's Pierre Boisson in Burgundy. They'll never hear this because they have absolutely zero internet presence. Mm-hmm. They do not have an Instagram account. They don't have a web page. They don't have a Twitter account. They don't have anything, as far as I can tell. And that is so unusual these days. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think even like the top end Burgundy producers at least have like a holding page for their website now. No information on there, but at least they kind of acknowledge that the internet exists. And yet this producer, Pierre Boisson, is pretty well thought of. I mean, I don't know much about them. I was trying to find out, and I couldn't really. Not with any great authority. And so, that for me was very interesting to see how some people are kind of still managing to resist getting themselves online at all, apparently.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And I guess that in a lot of those sorts of cases I've come across, you're then over to hashtags and you're over to, again, what is it, user generated content, people actually just posting their own opinions and, nothing official from the producer.
I'll give you another good example. Again, something I was researching today. You may be familiar with a Valpolicella producer called Dalforno Romano, one of the top names. Mm-hmm. And they make an Amarone, which is their top wine. They make a Valpolicella. And when you look on the label, it says Valpolicella Superiore. There's some other information. But it's not classified as a ripasso. And sorry if I'm losing anybody here. We're going into kind of some technical detail, but ripasso is a winemaking technique. And I'm pretty sure that it's made in that way. And I started trying to search on Google for this wine mm-hmm. to see if I could find out a reputable source of information that would tell me, with authority, whether it was ripasso. And I couldn't. And I think that's partly because Google has, the research results on Google have definitely changed in the last few years. And I've been very interested in following various technology reporters who are trying to explain why this is. I don't mind admitting to you that I went on ChatGPT and typed in the question, is Dalforno Romano Valpolicella Superiore a ripasso style wine? And not only did I get an instant answer, which is that it's basically semi-ripasso. They kind of do a half-dried, assuming it's true, which, I'm taking a lot on trust there. But then so are you with Google. You're taking it on trust. But it was so interesting to me that after 5 or 10 minutes of absolutely fruitless Googling, all I basically got was links to websites trying to sell me often a different wine, frankly.
Yeah.
No quality information that an AI chat device was not only able to understand my question, but to give me the instant answer, which I'm pretty sure, having now verified it with other people, was absolutely accurate.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I think AI is again. I think it's another opportunity. I think it's again, potentially an hour long segue. So, in the time that we have, again, I do love these conversations, because I think they will hopefully lead to other responses and other thoughts. We haven't come here with an agenda. We've just, I guess, talked about what's front of mind, and through that lens of communication, I think you've earned that right to put those thoughts out into the world, and we'll be sharing those. But one thing, maybe to flip the script 180 degrees, is actually to talk about, I guess, the antithesis of AI, which is something that's so human, which are the recent 67 Pall Mall Awards that you led and you hosted just last month in London. So I'd love for you now, with a little bit of distance between yourself and the awards, really just to reflect on that process, because I think it was certainly for myself as an entrant, and from what I saw happening around that, it really did seem to strike a chord with many people in the wine industry.
Yes. Well, thank you. It really was a cause dear to my heart, because, as I said right at the beginning, it was entering competitions that started my career in communication anyway. And there hasn't really been one dedicated to wine communication globally across any platform. There are book competitions, and then there are sort of specific wine writing competitions where you have to write a particular piece of content. Jancis Robinson's website does an extremely good version of that every year. But this is designed really to support wine professionals who are trying to communicate for a living. Although it was great that we got some entrants from people who are not wine professionals at all, that just happen to have a channel on Instagram and create some really interesting content. So the idea was celebrate the world's greatest wine communicators. It was important to me that we did have a global reach. We had judges from Hong Kong, Australia, California, the UK, Germany, and we did manage to reach a really good representation from a lot of different countries. There were written entries, video entries, and audio entries. There was a huge array of styles. I mean, a bewildering, fascinating array of all sorts of different styles, huge array of different topics. Diversity was really important. I wanted to try and ensure that we were representing lots of different stories about wine, but also from lots of different backgrounds. So I can give you a bit of context on that. There used to be a competition called the Louis Roederer International Wine Writer Awards, and I entered that every year religiously. And when I was putting together this, the 67 awards, I looked back at the old pictures of it. And there was a kind of, one of the classic sort of classroom style class of whenever it was, 2010. And everybody gathered in a room. And the faces there were overwhelmingly white, middle-class male. And of course, I am one, so I'm not trying to, make myself a hero here or anything. But I looked at that and thought, wow, back then, nobody was talking about it. I shouldn't think anybody really especially noticed it, because of course everybody just sees people that look exactly like them. And these days, thank goodness, there's much, much more proactive, conscientious change on that front. Having Elaine Chokan-Brown as our chair of judges was fundamental to that. She does great work for championing diversity across the whole of the wine world. So, it was not just finding great wine communicators, bringing them together for a nice party and, picking a few winners. That's always the bit that is sort of almost a shame, because you don't want people to just focus on the names of people that have won. It was really, for me, it was about the process and everybody that entered and getting that engagement. And of course, I just want to be absolutely straight with everybody. It's for 67 Pall Mall, it's a great way of putting us in front of a great audience and, getting to meet lots of people. We are genuinely in support of the wine world. We want to be friends with wine communicators, and anybody that's out there promoting wine is ultimately helping our business, because maybe one day those people will become members of the club. So we didn't have a huge ulterior motive, but we definitely wanted to do it as an exercise that kind of helped us, connect with people. So yeah, overall, great success. Very, very happy. Currently putting together plans for 2025. Very similar format, I think. A few tweaks, maybe an additional expanded kind of event itself. Not this ceremony. I liked how that was quite compact and quick, but maybe a kind of satellite event is being discussed to take advantage of the fact that so many people came over. So that has been a really good way for me to, I guess, pay it back in some way. The fact that I've had a 23-year career and been involved in communication for most of that. It felt really good being able to run something which helped other people.
Yeah, and again, I think there was a palpable buzz. I think a lot of excitement around that, and it from what I saw, it certainly looked like a huge success. So in the best, again, the best way to judge people is from their actions and not necessarily their words. So if you're doing it again, and I think there's people are entering again, and hopefully there's more people entering, and the direction is upwards, then I think that kind of really speaks volumes in and of itself. Again, I've could so much that I could ask about the awards and the stages, but I also in a winemaker sense, I don't like to extract too much. Let's say in one go. I think that always leave the door open. And I think in closing, really, and I think it's a nice way to kind of close the circle. Really, is if you really to talk a bit about the book that you've just launched, because I think this again, rooted in communication. It brings out the elements of the cross-cultural communication that we've spoken about there. Elements of food, elements of travel. It feels very much as though this encapsulates our conversation. So I think really please just introduce us to, I guess, the genesis of the book, because I think that would really be interesting, and presumably something that you've been driving from the very start, or and involved in from the very start, right the way through to publishing, which I think is going to be exciting.
So, it's called Wine and the Food of Asia. It is a 67 Pall Mall book. It's our third book that the club has published. And actually credit for the idea goes to Grant, the founder of the club. He wanted to make a series of books. The first one is very much about the London club and the classic recipes we have there. The second one is about Bordeaux, where we have a club opening. Not just the wine of Bordeaux, but the food of Bordeaux in the southwest of France. And then, because obviously I've been based in Asia, and we have opened the Singapore club to try and be a new sort of hub for Southeast Asia, and it's such a melting pot of different cuisines that it made sense for us to do something that took the wine of Asia, or rather the food of Asia, which is a massive subject. I mean, ridiculously huge. We got nowhere near covering everything, but we tried to represent all of the major countries and most of the kind of better known dishes. So the second half of the book is recipes, 80 recipes, each of which has got a primary wine match and then one or two extras. And it includes most of the stuff that people will be familiar with, like pad thai and butter chicken and Peking duck. And then some more ambitious things, some things I hadn't come across before, like mohinga, some Japanese dishes I wasn't very familiar with, chow and mushi and okonomiyaki. I hope I'm saying those correctly. I've only ever seen them written down. So each of those, there's a recipe, very classic recipe. It's our own recipe, but we didn't try and break the rules or do anything fusion. It's just a very classic recipe with a wine match explaining why the wine matches with the food. The first half of the book is a more detailed wine-centric book, which looks firstly at wine styles, so heavy reds, light reds, aromatic whites, oaky whites, as categories, and considers what kinds of Asian foods they would go with, whether it's a kind of earthy type of food or whether it's a very piquant, spicy type of food. And then the next section reverses that and takes an individual spice and tries to find a wine that goes with it. This was definitely the most difficult part. And it's very speculative. I've written that there are certain wines that will go with cumin, certain wines that will go with coriander, certain wines that will go with coconut milk and soy sauce and so on. And of course, most recipes take all of those dishes and put them together. All of those ingredients, take all of those ingredients, put them together to make a dish. So you can't really isolate those spices. But it was actually a really interesting way of doing it and saying, no, you know what, there is a way that I can justify that this particular style of wine has got some affinity with this particular flavor. It's not going to work for everyone, but it was genuine research that I did over the course of 2 years and tried dozens and dozens and dozens of combinations, literally tasting dishes with different wines, figuring out what worked, coming back the following day, repeating it with a different set of wines, refining it, improving the recipe, like very gradual, very thorough, and not based on any other research. I'd never written really about wine and food matching before. It's not something I consider myself an expert in. So I was coming to it as a sort of an outsider. And the result, the book, is a big coffee table style book full of very beautiful photography that we did ourselves with a fantastic team. So it's a gorgeous object. I'm really very proud of how it looks and how it comes across. But there's some substance to it. It is full of 100% original research in terms of how I discovered what wines will go with the foods of Asia.
I mean, that all sounds incredible. I think, also what comes to mind as well is just your own process on writing that book, because I guess as well, you needed to research what was already out there, potentially researching what was already out there not in your native language, actually in the sort of local languages there. So I think, that the story of that process, I think, would be, super interesting way to again, really sort of, I think flesh out and share, a lot of what you've learned about communication, because it's not a small undertaking, is it? Especially when you've got, the 67 Pall Mall name on the spine.
Yeah, well, I looked for as many other books that did the same thing. Certainly the book we've just published is by no means the first to do it. I think the first most important one was Asian Palette by Jeannie Cho Lee. And that was definitely the one that kind of made the most impact. And then I've seen some other versions, some of which are, very amateur in the French sense of the word, done by people who are not professionals but wine lovers. And they were interesting to read, but often fell into some cliches that I actually don't happen to think are true myself in my research. Things like Gewürztraminer going with curry, that kind of thing. That felt often like I didn't really believe what I was reading. It certainly wasn't true in my research. The thing about other languages is intriguing. So actually, my MW research paper, when I passed in 2015, was about 100 years of wine books. I took 100 years of wine books that had been published from the British Library Records, which has a record of every book published. I'm pretty sure that 98% of wine books are published in English. And actually, I think the interesting question about, if you were looking for resources on wine and food matching written in different languages, would you really look for books? I suspect not. I think you'd be looking on social media, on video, in China, on WeChat. It's writing for sure, or not always, but very often it can be. And it's a completely different channel to what we're used to from the traditional UK perspective about wine communication.
I love it. And I'll give you the final word, is really just to share, I guess, first off, where can people find the book, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who are interested. And secondly, where can they find you online?
Well, the book is on its way to the UK right now and should be available on Amazon. It is definitely available at the Singapore club. So if anybody's passing through Singapore, then they can come and find me there. And it's available online and in a few local bookshops in Singapore. But I think Amazon's going to be the place where most people can find it globally. And of course, in the London club and in our Melbourne club as well, which is going to be opening next year. Myself, I'm on richardhemmingmw.com, which has got links to most of the other places where I do various bits of writing and video and bits and bobs. So people can find me there.
A huge thanks to today's guest, Richard Hemming MW, Head of Wine Asia for 67 Pall Mall Singapore. Do be sure to visit richardhemmingmw.com, the link below, where you can learn more about Richard, find his writings and his main social media handles. And of course, why not reach out to Richard to let him know what you thought of the episode and ask any questions that he raised. Next time on Interpreting Wine's Mosaic of Wine Series 1 in episode 566, I'll be speaking with Sarah Jane Evans, Master of Wine. Make sure you're subscribed to be alerted when that episode goes live. See you then.